A little bit about myself. My name is Taylor, and I call Singapore home. I'm a PR, and for my first 8 years here, I've been in manufacturing and oil and gas industries on Jurong Island for companies like ExxonMobil and Air Liquide. Recently, in the past 2 years, I've been on a personal sabbatical to research into solutions for sustainability, including agri-tech, vertical farming, and climate change solutions, the Green New Deal. Last year in September, I volunteered with local climate activists, Singapore Climate Rally, to host an education booth about climate crisis. And I also partnered with other groups of volunteers, 350.org, to submit a policy proposal to the Singapore government about which kinds of policy solutions could help Singapore to do its part to reduce carbon emissions. For this session, I'd like to share with you some of the highlights from that research. Just now we watched a video of CNA to talk about climate change as a wicked problem. Climate change is caused by burning fossil fuels and heating up the Earth's atmosphere, causing many extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and making the Earth less hospitable for human life. We also learned in the video that while there are numerous engineering and policy solutions, what is lacking is the political will to pay for and implement these solutions. You may remember Assad mentioned that we need to move beyond focusing on individual actions, recycling, reducing plastic waste, and deal with the problem at the systemic level of root cause to the people who are making these decisions in banks, courts, policymakers, and corporations. We also heard Angel Tsu from Yale in US explain why we call it a wicked problem. The 4 reasons she mentioned is that time is running out, people who are supposed to be part of the solution are in fact part of the problem. On many levels at international and local, there is a collective action failure for people to do the right thing. And we as individuals have psychological imperfections that do not prepare us well to solve such types of problems. We tend to discount things in the future more than we should rationally, and also we tend to believe falsely that our societies, governments, families, and the companies we work for are all generally doing things in a just and fair way, something known as the just world fallacy. In reality, events in the future will eventually become the present, and the world is not perfect. Sometimes unjust things happen, and bad people get away with doing bad things. And you'll see how all of this is related to the crisis that we face. So we'll have a look first at how climate change could affect you. And then we'll talk about the solutions, the Green New Deal, and then we'll take a look at how Singapore is doing, and then finally we'll end up with a discussion about how you as a student could get involved and make a difference. Climate change means more frequent extreme weather events, which could disrupt food supplies and put more people in extreme poverty. Singapore imports 95% of our food, so when other countries have limited food to feed their populations, they may think twice before exporting to Singapore. And as the world moves on to solve climate change, one of the more direct ways that Singapore could be affected is if Singapore is too slow to transition from the sunset industries that it currently relies on, such as the airlines, tourism, and the fossil fuel industry, then a slow move by Singapore government could result in fewer economic opportunities for young Singaporeans. So you may be asking yourself, what's this got to do with me? Well, the point is it's your future that is at stake here. This is a graph of the different emission scenarios. They're called RCPs, but you can think of them as how much greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere and how much that translates into warming. Up at the top is a red curve, which is what some people refer to as the worst case scenario. Take a look at this, but the ones I'd like to point to is this black curve, which is 2 to 4 degrees Celsius warming, and the blue curve, which is what would happen if we were to reduce our emissions and limit global warming to 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. Now the difference between these two curves is a difference between a world which has some increase in warming and some melting glaciers and some sea level rise to a world but adaptable and something that we can live with to something that is very inhospitable for human life, where there's lots of portions of the planet which have ecosystem collapses, there's less food supply to go around, and generally it's harder for us to be able to enjoy life as we do currently today. This black line is what we call the business as usual scenario, and that's currently what we're on if we don't take any action. And keep in mind the time scale here. So when the way that climate change will happen is it's a very slow process. And what we're doing today will not immediately take place because it's stored in the oceans. It will be gradually get worse and worse and worse over several decades. And we will start to see some pretty dramatic changes starting in around the mid-century or 2050 in this case. Now think about it. In 2050, how old will you be? Well, you'll probably be turning somewhere in your 40s. You'll be, getting into your career. You'll be a little bit older than me. How old will I be? Well, I'll be in my 70s. I'll be on my way out of, my generation will be on the way out of power. And we will be transitioning to your generation to be the ones. Now, at that time, keep in mind, very bad things will be happening. There will be coral reefs that will be going completely gone. There will be lots of extinctions. There will be very bad weather events that will displace millions of people from their homes, and it will only be getting worse because we have the rest of this curve for more sea level rise in the future. So you will be telling your children at that time and preparing them for increasingly worse events, even though you're trying to do everything you can to stop it. So the main point is to say that at that time in 2050, you will not have a chance to go back in time. Whatever we do now will have set the fate for what you have to deal with at that time. And everybody will know. There will not be a debate. Now, I will be in my 70s, but the people who are currently making decisions in corporations and banks and in governments, these people will be dead. Most of the people that you look up to now that are your leaders and the people who you see as authority, they will all be dead by then. So that's a problem because the people who are going to face the consequences is you. This is your future, but you don't have the direct ability to control the outcomes. That's being decided by these people who are in these positions of power. And that's one of the difficulties of climate change. But it gets a little bit worse than that because there's these things called tipping points. Probably the most dangerous part of climate change. A tipping point is the point where human intervention is no longer possible because the main causes from the Earth system feedbacks, and humans are no longer in control. That's scary because we can cross a point where no return, where Earth starts warming uncontrollably, rendering the planet completely unrecognizable and making it difficult for any human life or any form of civilization that any of us would recognize. An example of a feedback loop that could lead to a tipping point is the effect of sea ice melting. The white color of sea ice reflects the sun's radiation back into space, but the underlying dark blue ocean absorbs more heat. That's known as the albedo effect, and it makes the warming of the Earth faster than it would be otherwise because of a vicious positive feedback loop. You see, when the Earth's warming leads to more sea ice melt, then that increases the albedo effect that leads to more warming, that leads to more sea ice melt. I think you get the idea. That's a dangerous situation to be in because it means the warming is no longer in our control, but the feedback loop just keeps going out of control. It's the same dynamics of how fires start. If you make a small campfire, as long as it's a small campfire and you can put it out, that's okay. But if it happens to spread and catch a few trees, then it can spread to the whole forest and go beyond your ability to stop any further spreading. That's how positive feedback loops work, and they're very dangerous. The albedo effect is just one of many possible positive feedback loops in the Earth's climate system. So we're literally playing with fire. Time's running out. Although the scenario of global warming has been clear for the past 20 years, emissions continue to rise, and we're reaching close to the point where we'll no longer be able to have a chance to prevent the worst. To get back on track to 1.5C, we need to cut emissions by half by no later than 2030. For wealthy countries like Singapore, that means reducing by more than 60% or higher. So why are we so far behind? Well, we use fossil fuels for energy for our economic activity. We have a flawed economic system that's wasteful, and it benefits a few while many people are still poor. The economic system encourages people to think about their individual situations and discourages collective action, leading to collective action failure and leading countries to not cooperate with one another. Our psychology tends to lead us to believe that governments are doing the right thing, even though they're not. That is a just world fallacy, and it also leads us to over-discount the future more rashly than we should. Finally, we have criminals from the fossil fuel industry who have been actively undermining progress and have been sending out misleading information to the public to distract and delay moving out of fossil fuels. Here's a quote from a youth activist from Sweden, Greta Thunberg. The only thing we need to look at is this emissions curve, and I'm sorry, but it's still rising. The curve is the one thing we should look at. Every time we make a decision, we should ask ourselves, how will this decision affect that curve? We should no longer be measuring our wealth and success in that graph that shows economic growth, but in the curve that shows the emissions of greenhouse gases. We should no longer ask, have we got enough money to go through this, but also, have we got enough of that carbon budget to spare to go through with this? That should and must become the center of our new economy. If we look back in history, we'll find that past civilizations have made similar mistakes. When we look at Easter Island, for example, we can learn some lessons. That civilization, like our own, was based on accumulating resources to a small, powerful minority at the expense of the majority of the population. Over a period of decades and centuries, they experienced what we would call today economic growth. They used trees as resources faster than the rate at which the trees would normally replenish themselves. They made bad decisions that made collectively everyone worse off, but allowed a small minority to profit. At that time, it was a status symbol to have a bigger statue than your neighbor, similar to today, how some people think that success is measured by having a condo instead of a 4-room HDB flat. While times were good, many people believed falsely that the system was just, even though they were very rich, very poor people, and limited natural resources were being depleted. These changes occurred slowly over generations, so like today, they also discounted how their actions would have consequences for future generations. Eventually, the growth did not last. Small climate variations came into play. Resource depletion reversed the growth trend into a sharp decline. We call this collapse. That's because the accumulation and wastefulness starved the sources from where that wealth originally came from, which is the people and the environment. During that period of decline, there was intense violence, poverty, and even cannibalism where people eat one another. There have been many civilization collapses, in fact, and climate change and flawed economic systems are a common factor in all of them. So today, there are no more trees on Easter Island, and it's practically void of any human population. The problem of Easter Island is when the economic system that organizes society incentivizes people to look after their own individual interest at the expense of the collective well-being of everyone. We call this a collective action failure when people are competing instead of cooperating. But fortunately, there is some hope. In 2015 in Paris, France, 192 countries made history by signing an international agreement to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees. This is known as the Paris Agreement, which was mentioned in the CNA video. But there's a problem. The Paris Agreement is voluntary. It only works if governments voluntarily follow the agreement and do their part of what are known as pledges, or NDCs. In many countries, and particularly the advanced wealthy economies, they take these pledges seriously, such as South Korea and Sweden. The corrupt politician Donald Trump said he wanted to pull out of the Paris Agreement, and that shocked many people. But fortunately, he'll be out of office in 2 weeks, so fortunately that crisis will be over soon. But leaders from other countries like Singapore and Australia have poor commitments and do not appear to have any plans to change them in the near future. It's not just countries like Singapore and Australia which are not doing their part on the Paris Agreement. The corporations that are responsible for the climate crisis have been actively engaged in criminal activity to lie to the public about the science because they knew it would be bad for their profits. In fact, they've been actively working to delay the meaningful action not only for the past 20 years, but even before the scientific community fully understood what was going on. You see, since as early as the 1980s, the oil and gas companies, in particular ExxonMobil, have known exactly what would happen as a result of their business of burning fossil fuels for transportation. Their knowledge was so precise, in fact, they were able to predict with stunning precision both the rise in CO2 and the temperature rise. On this plot here, you can see the original prediction overlaid with the actual data. They've known for decades that their business risked potentially catastrophic sea level rise that would flood many cities. They also knew all along what they were doing, and instead of informing the public so that we could all decide how to deal with the problem, they didn't just sit on the information, they actually went one step further to actively lie to the public to prevent any meaningful action. They interfered in politics and can still be interfering to this day in countries like the United States and in Singapore. This is a quote from a leaked internal memo from 1998, just 16 years after their initial report on science of global warming. Victory will be achieved when the average citizen feels uncertain about science of global warming, and not only citizens but media, government, and that undermines the efforts of international agreements. At the time, it was the Kyoto Treaty before the Paris Agreement. So, did you see anything uncertain about the chart that I just showed you just now? Well, I didn't. One of the main reasons why we have collective action failure and a flawed economic system that is dependent on fossil fuels is that there are corporations that have been lying about the science and profiting from those lies. In other words, criminal activity. They won't be able to do this much longer, though. Currently, they're being sued for lying to the public, and not just one, but several U.S. states. So why would they risk paying fines and possibly jail time to lie to the public and threaten the lives of millions of citizens around the world? And why are countries like Singapore so slow to do their part on the Paris Agreement? Well, it's simple. To solve the climate crisis, we need to pay the costs and the damages created by the fossil fuel companies. As they say, nothing in life comes for free. But these costs are important questions. Exactly how much will it cost? Can Singapore afford the cost? What will be the impact on jobs? What will happen to low-income families? Well, that's where policy starts to come in. That's what a Green New Deal is all about, in fact. It's a way to pay for the investments to transition the economy away from the fossil fuels from sunset to growth industries and prepare Singapore to thrive and prosper in the 21st century global economy, not continue to be live by the flawed economic model that we're currently experiencing. So what is a Green New Deal exactly? And why do we call it a Green New Deal? Well, it's helpful again to look back at history, to learn lessons from not just ancient civilizations on Easter Island, but more recent lessons from the Great Depression in the 1930s for how to deal with our flawed economic system. At that time, there were a number of similarities as we have today. Just as today, there was rapid advancement and technological improvement from the revolution. But the economic, they call it laissez-faire, or what we call today free market, which is basically means no rules or limited rules for corporations. These policies enable the benefits to accrue to a small number of wealthy people through corporations, while everyone else is relatively poor. Once the suppression set in, just as today with the COVID-19 virus, corporations were not willing to make the investments voluntarily to employ all these people. So at the same time, just as now, there was an environmental and agricultural crisis that was based on poor land use and farming in the Midwest, and known as the Dust Bowl. It took some time for governments to figure out exactly how to solve this problem, but one famous economist finally figured out the solution. His name is John Maynard Keynes. People today who follow the way that he has economic models are known as Keynesian economists. What he figured out was that when governments make investments in people to feed them, to house them, to give them good education, healthcare, and invest in work projects for conserving the environment and building new public infrastructure, it's a win-win because it improves people's lives, reduces inequalities, and it restores the natural resources and creates economic activity. That program was known as the New Deal. And that's why governments are all around the world in Europe, US, South Korea, they're all adopting Green New Deal programs because they understand that Keynes knew how to deal and heal with these flawed economic systems. So what exactly is a Green New Deal policy for Singapore? It's all about listening to the scientists and getting the targets right for the Paris Agreement, moving away from growth to a steady state, no growth, economy, and improving the lives of everyday Singaporeans. The Green New Deal, instead of letting corporations make all the decisions about the economy, it places citizens and workers in charge of the economic decisions through co-creation and collective ownership. Green New Deal recognizes that workers in the sunset industry, fossil fuels, etc., and tourism must be taken care of so that they are not left behind in the process. The climate crisis will affect our neighbors in ASEAN, and we will need their help also, too, for food as well as renewable energy. So our interdependence with the region will force us to focus less on our global relationships and more on being a leader and team player in the region. This is just a quick overview, and there's more in my research. But in fact, there's a lot more details by many thousands of people who have put together Green New Deal policy plans all around the world. That's what I've spent my research on. I feel very excited. There's a good opportunity for Singapore to prosper in the 21st century. So now that we have an idea of what the science of the problem is and what the policy solutions are, let's take a look at how Singapore is doing its part. At last year's National Labor Rally speech in August 2019, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong addressed the nation with a speech on climate change. It's noteworthy that the government makes an effort to be open and transparent about the risk of climate change. Now, some of you may have heard it said, but Singapore only contributes 0.11% of global emissions. While that might be true for emissions inside Singapore's borders, it doesn't include emissions from activity beyond our borders that we're responsible for financing. When adding together the amounts 2 to 3 times territorial emissions. Also, 0.11% for a country that's only 0.07% of the world's population, is at 5.6 million people. That's a lot. When we compare ourselves to other cities, Singapore is right at the top of the list and one of the worst carbon polluting cities in the world at 30 tons of carbon emissions per year. Yikes. But what you might not know is that what you might not know is that not all of Singaporeans are responsible for that 30 tons. Most heartlanders, in fact, have a low footprint compared to the average urban citizen around the world. So where is all these emissions coming from? The overwhelming majority of Singapore's emissions is from industry, and specifically those climate criminals from the petrochemicals industry, ExxonMobil, Shell, and PetroChina. Together, these three companies make up for 60% of our greenhouse gas emissions, not including the emissions from the products they sell, yet they only employ less than 2% of our workforce. As the world moves towards bolder climate action, they may soon become a liability for the government and the citizens as they lay off workers, face cash crunches, and may leave stranded assets that are left for the citizens to clean up later on. That means you. So another point of Singapore's emissions, over 95% of electricity is from natural gas. For us to reach net zero, we have to stop all that. So who's consuming all that electricity? Well, it's mostly industrial and commercial corporations, with the next group being residential homes. Only a tiny portion can be attributed to government buildings such as schools and government offices. Also, while plastic has its environmental consequences, it contributes very little to our greenhouse gas emissions, less than 4%. So now, for Singaporeans who are less familiar with the energy systems, it might seem daunting or impossible for how Singapore could realistically reach zero by 2050. But so long as the projects are funded properly, as we're learning from the CNA video, the solutions are there. So what are the solutions? Well, the Singapore government has come up with a nice catchphrase, the 4 switches. That's mostly correct, but there's one switch which they conveniently left out. Let's see if you can guess which one it is. So for a complete solution, we need to make 5 switches. So if you guessed right, the one they left out was downsizing the petrochemicals industry, which is the very first thing that we need to do if we're going to hit our targets. The next switch that they alluded to is, they mentioned hydrogen, but the video did not go fully to explain where the hydrogen comes from. I'll fill that gap for you. So hydrogen can come from either one of 3 sources. It's either nuclear power, fossil fuels in a way that doesn't pollute greenhouse gases, but instead puts it back in the ground, also known as carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS. And this is also a solution for our natural gas power plants, which they did not mention in the video. There's a third option called green hydrogen, which will directly convert renewables, but it's currently at a state it's very expensive and energy efficient, almost 2 to 3 times higher than CCS. So it's not yet ready for full-scale implementation. A third option is solar, both domestic and solar from our neighbors in the ASEAN power grid. And the fourth is to phase out the non-substitutable emissions from internal combustion engine, that's our cars and buses. And finally, the fifth step is to upgrade our energy performance in buildings. So the later 4 of these have already been identified as part of the government's low emissions long-term development strategy. The only missing piece is the economic transformation of which downsizing of the petrochemicals element. So in terms of how well is Singapore doing? Well, the short answer is they're not doing their part. And this is just not my assessment. This is a similar conclusion reached by local climate activists in the Singapore Climate Rally, as well as international nonprofit organizations, Climate Action Tractor, where you can find the full country profile assessment. It's not all bad. There are some positive points. One of the strongest points for Singapore is a long history of aggressive policy on reducing car ownership, which is taxed very heavily, and now they're moving to phase out the internal combustion engine by 2035 or 2040. Some other areas that are noteworthy is the ambition on expanding solar, which we saw in the CNA video, and upgrading building efficiencies. Unfortunately, these are small efforts, much less than what is called for to solve the problem. Not enough money is being spent where the problem is, which is the petrochemicals industry and the natural gas power plants. Solutions have been fed back to the government by local NGOs, and I've compiled them here as the main recommendations. The first one is to not be like Trump, and instead listen to the scientists to align the commitments to the Paris Agreement to scientifically determine targets consistent with the 1.5C path. The next is to deal directly with the root cause and confront our flawed economic model, such as Greta suggested, to look for more meaningful ways to measure our success and retire GDP's role in how we make decisions on policy. Not only listening to scientists, but also to adopt international policy recommendations from economists such as IMF to raise the carbon tax to $100 a ton, which would enable the 5 switches to be funded properly. And of course, we have to downsize the petrochemical industry. In fact, things are moving so fast that this may not be something we can control. The industry will shrink, so it's a matter of whether it's in a controlled way that is less disruptive, or if it's in a chaotic mess for your future generations to have to deal with. Unfortunately, while the Singapore government generally acknowledges these recommendations, they oppose acting on them. So that's what all the experts in the video are feeding back and trying to tell you, which is that we don't lack scientific or engineering solutions, and we also don't lack policy solutions. We have the Green New Deal. What we lack is political will to pay for them to get them implemented. So to sum up in a few words, let's go faster. So if we have the engineering solutions, if we have the policy solutions, so then what does that mean? How can I, as an individual student, fit into all of this? After all, you're not Lee Hsien Loong, right? Well, as it turns out, that's exactly where it's your turn to step in, because that's our job. It's our job to create the will so that the leaders have the mandate from the people to act, because after all, they work for us. So think of it this way. There are different ways that you can solve a problem. For example, let's say you can solve it directly at the science, at the physical level. You can solve it at the engineering level. You can solve it at the policy level, or you can collectively organize. And this is going to depend on how big the problem is. So take, for example, if you see a small fire in a wastebasket. Well, that's a pretty small problem where you have the means to solve it directly. You understand the science, you have the means to act, you do it. It's simple. Okay, but now let's look at a problem a little more involved, a plumbing leak in your apartment. In this case, you start with the science, the physical problem, but now you need to do a second step, which is determine the right engineering solution, because unlike the fire extinguisher, you don't have the means to directly solve the problem, but instead you'll need to hire a professional plumber to do the job for you. The costs are pretty affordable, $100 or so you can directly solve the problem at the engineering level using your own resources to pay it. Now let's look at a slightly more complex problem on a larger scale. Let's say a problem like what I face in a manufacturing plant, such as an intermittent reliability problem on a transmitter. Now in this case, there may not be one single engineering solution that will work, and also just because the solutions on paper works, without training and resources still might not work as intended. Furthermore, I'm not spending my own money, but instead I'm granted with a budget to work with. There may be several thousand or millions of dollars that ultimately are coming from the business that I have to work with. Here I have some discretion, but I also need to work within an institution and persuade managers for permission. So while I can't directly intervene with one particular engineering solution, instead what I can do is I can use a policy that implements those solutions. The thing is, the scale is fairly limited in this example. It's just one plant and one company. Now, when we're dealing with something as big as the Earth's atmosphere, we're dealing with multiple overlapping institutions, and on this scale, governments are the only ones who can effectively deal with such problems. No one else has the resources or the influence to affect such wide-scale activity. So governments, banks, multinational corporations are the ones who are in a position to use policy implementations to solve these types of problems. So then that's where we come into the picture, because we can organize ourselves collectively to move these institutions to take on these policies. Practically, that's the only way that we can have a realistic way of solving this problem on such a large scale as the Earth's atmosphere. And that's exactly what young people around the world are doing, and in Singapore, such as Greta and as she climate rally here in Singapore. And the good news is, that's working. So what does it mean to organize collectively to move society to adopt solutions? Well, it starts on a small scale with the people you know and see every day, your friends, your family, your school, your classmates. It's about relationships and getting to know your classmates, getting to know them as a person, what they care about, who they are. And crucially, the next step is to organize to solve problems together in teams and make commitments with one another, kind of like team sports. It's just not a bad idea to try to solve the climate crisis alone. It's actually impossible. The only way that we're going to be able to solve the climate crisis is to work together in small teams. Alone we can't do much, but together we can do a lot. Just look at the SG Climate Rally. It was organized by just a small team, maybe 6 to 12 dedicated students just like you. So here are 3 simple tips to remember about how you can make a difference in the climate crisis. Voice, vote, and volunteer. Your voice is the most powerful tool that you have in solving the problems collectively. When we solve problems in teams as equals, that means that we share our decisions by casting our votes. That's what it means to make decisions collectively in teams. Finally, to move on to action means to volunteer. We can't wait for paid opportunities from corporations, but we can get started by volunteering outside of our normal routine with volunteer-led organizations such as Climate Rally.